Chapter 8, St Peter and St Paul. It has been said that St Nazarius and St Celsus were martyred at a time when there was a general persecution of the Christians. There were several of these general persecutions, and this one, which was the first, took place in the reign of the Emperor Nero, AD 64. Before this time, there had been no edict against the Christian religion, and though the Christians had often been persecuted, yet it had always been done in an irregular way, for they had never had a fair trial according to the laws, but had been ill-treated either by wicked governors or by mobs of people who believed all sorts of false charges against them. Besides, these chance persecutions took place only in single cities and at particular times, so that if a Christian was in danger in one city, he might escape to another, and very often he might return home after a short time when people's minds had got quieter. But now the case was very different, for an edict was issued against the Christians, and though no law can make it just to put innocent persons to death, yet people often fancy that when the law is against a man, he must be in the wrong. And many quiet folks, who had never before troubled their heads about the Christians, now began to think that they must be very wicked and must be doing a great deal of harm, since the emperor had actually been obliged to issue an edict against them. Everyone, therefore, set about persecuting them, giving information against them, and helping to have them put to death. This persecution began in the following way. A dreadful fire, such as had never before been known at Rome, suddenly broke out and burnt down the greater part of the city. The public distress was very great, for thousands of persons had lost everything they had in the world, and were turned out to live for weeks in the fields, without a roof to cover them, or any clothes to keep them warm. There were, of course, many inquiries into the way in which the fire had begun, and people wondered that nothing had been done to stop it. And then it began to be whispered about that the emperor himself had had the city set on fire, and had forbidden his officers to do anything to put out the fire, and that while the place was all in a blaze, he had looked down on it from a high tower, and had enjoyed extremely the grand spectacle which the flames presented. Nero was a very wicked man, and had actually killed his own mother and his wife and many of the Roman citizens, so there was nothing too bad for him to do. The people, therefore, believed that he was the cause of all their misery, and they began to hate him very bitterly. Nero was frightened when he found that all the Roman citizens hated him, for he was afraid they might rebel against him and kill him, as they had done to several other emperors. And he was therefore at some pains to make them think better of him. He opened his own gardens to receive the people whose houses had been burnt down. He gave them houses to live in till their own should be rebuilt, and he distributed corn among them. But all in vain, for nothing would persuade them but that he had set the city on fire. He then determined to shift the blame from himself to some innocent persons, and as the Christians were very generally disliked, he accused them of having done it, and he ordered them to be very severely punished. Numbers of persons were now seized and put to the torture, to make them confess that they were Christians, and as they did not wish to deny their religion, but were only too happy to suffer for it, the prisons were soon full of them. Every kind of torture was invented to increase their sufferings. Some were scourged, others were nailed to crosses. Others had to fight in the amphitheatre with wild beasts, while others again were sewed up in skins and thrown to dogs to be torn to death. But this cruel monster invented even a more horrible kind of death for them. He gave a grand entertainment to the people of Rome. He threw open his gardens, where there were chariot and horse races, and all sorts of amusements. And when night came on, there were splendid illuminations, and then, shocking to relate, the Christians, smeared over with pitch and other combustibles, were put in various parts of the gardens and set on fire to burn as torches, to give light in the darkness to the people who were walking about and amusing themselves. The very pagans turned in horror from the sight and began to pity the poor Christians whom they had hitherto hated. It was now nearly 25 years since St. Peter had first come to Rome. He had not, however, remained there all this time. Some people say that he went into Spain and Britain, but this is not at all certain. There is, however, no doubt that he went into the East to visit the churches in Asia, and that he held the first council of the Church, which met at Jerusalem, AD 51, for the purpose of deciding some disputes that had arisen between the converts from Judaism and those from paganism. After he had spent some years in the East, he returned again to Rome, AD 58, so that he was there when the persecution broke out. Another apostle was also in Rome at this time. This was St. Paul. He had been brought a prisoner to Rome several years before, and had been confined for 2 years in a house under the charge of a soldier. During that time he had frequent disputes with the Jews, who came to see him. He was examined by the Senate, and from one of his epistles it appears that he was taken before the Emperor Nero. At the end of the 2 years he was set at liberty and joined St. Peter in preaching at Rome. He did not, however, stay there long, but travelled into Italy, France, Spain, and some say even into Britain, spreading the gospel to the furthest parts of the West. After spending 8 years in this way, he returned to Rome a short time before the persecution began. It was a great comfort to the poor Christians to have these 2 princes of the apostles with them at this dreadful time. Both St. Peter and St. Paul were remarkable for their great love of souls. St. Paul remembered that he had once persecuted the Christians, and so, though he was so great an apostle, he called himself the chief of sinners, and thought he never could do enough to make reparation for his sins. St. Peter, too, could not forget that he had formerly denied Jesus, and though he knew that his dear Lord had forgiven him, he could never forgive himself. There never passed a day in which he did not weep for having grieved so kind and good a master, till at last his eyes became quite red from constant crying, and looked as if they had been dried in blood. So both these apostles, out of gratitude for Jesus' great love in forgiving them, laboured hard to convert sinners, and to bring them to love him as they themselves did. They now went about from house to house and prison to prison, encouraging those who were frightened on account of the persecution, and comforting those who were being tortured or who were in grief because their relations had been killed or imprisoned. Happily, St. Peter and St. Paul were left at liberty till towards the very end of the persecution. They were at last seized and thrown into the Mamertine prison, where they were kept shut up for 9 months. During this time they were not idle, for they took every opportunity of preaching the gospel to their guards and the other prisoners, and several persons were converted by their words and by the miracles they worked. Among these were Processus and Martinianus, 2 soldiers who guarded them, and who, being converted, threw themselves at their feet and begged to be baptized. The apostles were very willing to baptize them, but it did not seem possible, because there was no water in the prison. St. Peter, however, made the sign of the cross on the rock on which the prison stood, and immediately there sprang out of it a fountain of clear water, which may be seen there to the present day. 47 other persons were converted and baptized at the same time. The Christians could not make up their minds to lose both their great apostles at the same time, and so they did everything they could to persuade St. Peter to make his escape from prison, which he could easily do now that his guards, Processus and Martinianus, were Christians. For a long time St. Peter would not hear of such a thing, because he longed to die for Jesus, and was very glad to think that he should soon have that pleasure. But at last the tears and entreaties of the Christians got the better of him, and he consented, like a good shepherd, to save his life for the sake of his flock. So Martinianus and Processus led him secretly out of the prison, and he passed through the gate of the city without being observed by anyone. But as he was going along, walking away from Rome, and had arrived at a place called Sancta Maria ad Passus, where a small chapel now stands, he met our Lord walking towards Rome, as if he were going into the city. As soon as St. Peter saw Jesus, he knew him, and said to him, "Lord, whither dost thou go?" And Jesus answered, "I go to Rome to be crucified again." This seemed a strange answer, for Jesus was now ascended into his glory, and could not be crucified again in Rome. What, then, could he mean by saying that he was going to be crucified again? But St. Peter understood what he meant, and he knew that as Jesus could not be crucified again in his own person, he wished to be crucified in that of his servant Peter. So he immediately turned to go back to Rome, and returned to the prison, determined to wait there to be martyred according to his master's will. At length the day fixed for the execution of the apostles arrived. The sentence against them was that Peter, being a Jew, should be fastened to a cross, and that Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, should be beheaded. They were taken to the spot where the church of Santa Maria Transportina now stands, and there, being tied to 2 pillars, which are still kept in this church, they were cruelly scourged. They were then led forth to execution. On reaching the gate Trigemina or Ostiensis, which leads to Ostia, they had to separate, because they were to be executed at different places. So they embraced, and gave each other the kiss of peace, and parted joyfully, knowing most certainly that in a few minutes they would meet again in the presence of him who they both loved better than life itself. St. Peter was led to a high place near the Vatican called Mons Aureus, where they stripped him of his clothes and nailed him to a cross. Though he was very happy to die in the same manner as his master had done, yet he thought himself so unworthy of such a great honour that he wished some little difference to be made between them, and so he begged the executioners to place his cross in such a way that he should hang with his head downwards and his feet up in the air. In this position he would suffer much more pain, but he did not care for that, so long as he could have an opportunity of being humble and of placing himself in a worse posture than his Lord and Master had been in. In this manner died St. Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, watering and sanctifying with his blood the city which was destined to govern the Church in his name, and over which he has ever since watched from his place in heaven. His body was taken away by a priest called Marcellus, who embalmed it and buried it on a part of the Vatican at some distance from the spot where he was crucified. Meanwhile, St. Paul was led to the place appointed for his execution. When he came to the gate of the city, he met a Christian lady called Plautilla, who was crying very bitterly because he was going to be put to death. He asked her to lend him a handkerchief to bind his eyes, as was the custom with those who were beheaded, and he promised that it should be returned to her. She was very glad to do the least thing for him, and so she immediately gave him her handkerchief. As he went along, he converted 3 soldiers, Longinus, a Cestus, and Megistus, who were martyred a few days after. When he arrived at the place of execution, he prayed to God with great joy and fervour, and then, bowing his neck to the executioner's sword, his head was severed from the body. St. Chrysostom mentions that when his head was cut off, not a single drop of blood, but fountains of milk flowed from it, and as during his life he had had but one thought, which was Jesus, so now in death the same one thought followed him. For tradition says that when the head was severed from the body, it gave one leap, and then a second, and then a third, and at each leap the loved name of Jesus burst from the quivering lips, while on each spot on which the head rested, a fountain of water sprang up, which 3 fountains are to be seen to the present day. His body was taken away by a devout lady called Lucina, who buried it with great reverence in her own garden. After his death, St. Paul appeared to Plautilla and gave her back the handkerchief which she had lent him. There is an old fable about a monster called Hydra, which had a great many heads, and which never could be killed, because as soon as one of its heads was cut off, 2 new ones sprang up in its room. The Church was like this fabulous monster, for as fast as one Christian was put to death, others sprang up in his place. The martyrdom of one Christian was so often the cause of a great many conversions that it passed into a proverb that the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the Church. Thus the martyrdom of St. Peter and St. Paul led to the conversion of above 40 persons. A few days after they had been put to death, Processus and Martinianus, the soldiers whom St. Peter had baptized in prison, were brought before Paulinus, one of the judges. Longinus, Acestus, and Megistus, who had been converted by St. Paul as he went to martyrdom, were seized at the same time. Paulinus at first tried to persuade Processus and Martinianus to deny their religion. "Give up this folly," said he, "and return to the worship of the immortal gods who guard the Roman Empire, and to the religion in which you were born and bred, for be assured that if you do not, you will lose your rank and even your lives. Whereas if you do as I bid you, the Emperor will show you his favour and bestow great riches and honours on you." The Christian soldiers, however, answered him that they thought the faith and love of Christ worth much more than all the riches and honours the world contained. And as for death, it was long since they had learned not to be afraid of it. The Roman soldiers were trained in very strict discipline, and these bold words sounded strangely in the ears of a Roman judge like Paulinus. So he did not waste any more time in arguing with such foolish fellows, but ordered their mouths to be struck and all their teeth to be knocked out with large stones. Though such heavy blows on so tender a part as their jaws gave them excruciating pain, yet they did not care in the least for all that they suffered, but only said, "Glory to God in the highest." Paulinus then ordered an image of the heathen god Jupiter to be brought, and commanded them to adore it. But instead of obeying him, they spat in its face. Hereupon Paulinus flew into a great rage, and had them stripped naked and stretched upon the rack, so that their bones were all pulled out of joint. Their sides were also burnt with plates of red-hot iron, and their bodies were torn with a kind of whips called scorpions, and many other cruel tortures were inflicted on them. But they endured them all with great patience, singing songs of joy and triumph, and saying, "Thy name, O Lord, be for ever blessed. Let all thy angels praise thee, and let all thy creatures bless and glorify thee, for ever and ever." While these things were passing, the wicked judge Paulinus was suddenly struck blind, and at the same time he was seized with some dreadful pains all over his body, that it seemed as if he was beginning, even in this world, to suffer the torments that were awaiting him in hell. He lived 3 days in this horrible state, and then he died most miserably. Pomponius, his son, instead of being frightened by the judgment that had fallen on his father, thought only of revenging his death. He therefore went to the emperor and told him that Processus and Martinianus were magicians and had killed his father by their enchantments. So Nero ordered Caesarius, the governor of the city, to put them to death immediately, and Caesarius had them beheaded in the Via Aureliana, outside of the city. Their bodies were left to be devoured by dogs, but Luciana, the same devout lady who had buried St. Paul, took them up and buried them in her garden. They were afterwards laid in a church dedicated to their honour, and at last they were removed to the great church of St. Peter's at Rome. St. Peter and St. Paul were martyred on the 29th of June, AD 66, and St. Processus and St. Martinianus 3 days later, on the 2nd of July, on which days the Church keeps their respective feasts.